Let's bring in Cato Institute visiting fellow Emma Ashford. Emma, you take issue with Saudi Arabia's actions here as well?
I do. I think that these actions executing the cleric was a very aggressive activist act that they knew was going to provoke a response from countries in the region, and they went ahead and did it anyway.
Emma, but I mean, when we're talking about who our friends and who our foes are in the Middle East, it's hard to even tell right now.
It's very difficult, and I think a lot of people portray this as a sectarian struggle, Sunnis versus Shias. That's not entirely accurate. Some states that are in the Gulf Cooperation Council with Saudi Arabia, they're friendly towards Iran. There's a lot of different alliances going on here, and I think we see that only very few states followed Saudi Arabia in downgrading their diplomatic relations with Tehran.
Emma, to what extent is Saudi Arabia's action a response to U.S. diplomacy, to the fact that the United States has worked out this nuclear accord with the Iranians and appears to be trying to repair relations with Iranians? Are they acting out against the United States in part with what they're doing?
I think there's a lot of fear inside Saudi Arabia that the U.S. might be starting to reconsider its relations in the Middle East, and it's been 30-odd years where the U.S. has basically only backed Saudi Arabia and hasn't really looked anywhere else. So I think the nuclear deal, there's this fear it will rehabilitate Iran and maybe create better U.S.-Iranian relations. That worries them, but I don't think that's something that should worry them to the extent they seem to be.
You aren't troubled at all by, for example, the firing of those missiles very close to the USS Truman, and the fact that we had zero response to Iran, that we were going to roll out, the White House was going to roll out sanctions on some individuals and companies related to the ballistic missile program, and then we didn't do that? Are we sending the message to Iran, yeah, you got a free pass with us as long as you stick by that nuclear deal?
None of this means that Iran has suddenly become a good actor or a good country or a country that we can always be friends with. They do bad things too, but I think what we ought to be more aware of is the fact that Saudi Arabia, our closest ally in the region, also does some pretty terrible things. They have human rights violations, and more importantly, perhaps these days, they are actively destabilizing a lot of countries, particularly Yemen. They've been heavily involved in Syria. Their actions are more destabilizing than I think we like to pretend.
Emma, give us your best estimate of where this goes from here. How much more turmoil could we see, and how much more tension could grow out of this conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two of the most important countries and economies in the region?
It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think this will escalate past the diplomatic or perhaps economic tensions that we're seeing right now, but it is hard to say. This is the worst relations have been between the two countries since the mid-1980s, and what I would really like to see the White House do and the State Department is step in and perhaps try and ratchet down the tensions somewhat, rather than just backing.
To react at all, Emma, I think is what people want to see. The American people are saying, where are we on this? I mean, we have said such a gentle response. I'm just wondering, if this does come to blows, we had a 4-star general on here yesterday who said that this is going to escalate, it's going to lead to a hot war. If we do see Saudi Arabia and Iran and this rift continue to escalate, who is America going to support?
I don't believe we should be supporting anyone. Quite frankly, we have this long-running alliance with the Saudis that isn't necessarily in our best interests, and I think the biggest risk here isn't some kind of military escalation in the Gulf. I think the biggest risk here is that it prevents us finding some sort of solution to the Syrian civil war, and it prevents us from effectively fighting ISIS.
But
that's what we should be worried about.
Do we have the credit, does the United States have the credibility in the region anymore to de-escalate the way you're saying? Who's listening to us?
I do think we have the credibility. I think credibility is very much a straw man argument that people tend to trot out when they're worried about the U.S. doing something. The U.S. is still the major global power.
Are you suggesting our credibility hasn't taken a hit, Emma?
I don't believe it has. Perhaps we're not supporting the Saudis as mindlessly as we always used to, but I think that's a good thing. We're starting to think about what's good for the U.S. and what our interests in the region are. Those aren't necessarily the same as the Saudis.
All right, Emma Ashford, thank you for joining us and weighing in on that this morning.
Thanks.